Hello and welcome back to In Search of Black Power. I'm Lawrence Grand Prix, Director of Research for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle.
I'm Rasheem, independent scholar and researcher.
So this is part 2 of our conversation around the book When Affirmative Action Was White by Ira Katznelson. So I wanted to focus on the patterns of employment, and that led me to a topic that we've talked about a lot with what's in LBS, but wanted to sort of use this book as a way to talk about on the channel, which is the issue of unions. So the dominant narrative within many parts of the left is that unions are sort of independent organizing power for the working class, and that if we had more black people in unions, this could be a tool. More union power is good for black people because more working class power is going to redeem to us as a majority of the working class and poor. So Katznelson essentially argues the opposite in some ways, that in the midst of labor gaining more power in the response to the Great Depression, the New Deal, in response to World War II, that because of patterns of racial segregation within unions, that actually served to aggregate and increase white power overall. And I think it's a way to talk about some of the criticisms and limitations of how unions are traditionally talked about on the left as almost this unalloyed, uncomplicated entity of power, and the only problem is they're not strong enough, as opposed to how are they structured, what are their interests, how are they actually engaging some of these fundamental questions of race in America. So on that note, at a basic level, setting the stage. Obviously, the North had more industrial capacity than the South. And because of that, even though many northern unions were segregated, there was a much stronger union tradition in the North. South, you have agricultural work is literally hard to unionize. Like you have to walk onto the fields and say, would you like to join a union? Yeah. And obviously the South has different patterns of racism, the KKK. That does not mean there were not attempts at union organizing and even interracial union organizing in the South. You have the Knights of Labor. You have the Alabama Miners, which was a very strong, union that had a lot of black influence in it. That was oftentimes held up as unique, positive examples of interracial unionism in the South, even though people argue none of them actually were able to sustain their gains in long term because of the fundamental realities of the South. So within that dynamic, Great Depression comes in. People need jobs. The capitalist class has been thoroughly embarrassed and proven to be so leading the nation to destruction. So working class power has an opportunity to rise because people are so desperate, they're poor, and they're realizing, obviously, the limitations of capital domination as the mechanism to run America. So within that reality, World War II happens, unions are increasing their power, Cold War, rise in manufacturing with all the materials to run the Cold War. And these are some of the dynamics that Katznelson points out as the unions expand their power. The conditions for expanded union power, and one should read, because of segregation, largely white union power. The condition to expand largely white union power is the exclusion of black people in the South. So this is how Katznelson puts it, quote, "Well into the Eisenhower years, the strategy of offering concessions on issues of race, civil rights, and regional prerogatives worked to keep Southern Democrats in the fold as part of a broad progressive coalition. But these representatives proved less willing to stay on board in matters that involve labor unions and benefits for working Americans. In the 1930s, the Democratic Party, Northern and Southern Democrats working, as we have seen, in a strange bedfellows alliance, spearheaded initiatives that transformed the wages, working conditions, and hours of work for millions of Americans." Like, good. The majority of Southern members of Congress supported these bills, thus allowing the pivotal New Deal legislation to succeed. When they passed, unions were only a scant presence in the region, the South, hence not much of a threat. At the same time, the status of unions was very important to non-Southern Democrats who represented large industrial constituencies. The South was willing to support their wishes, provided these statutes did not threaten Jim Crow. The Southern members traded their votes for the exclusion of farm workers and maids and the most widespread black categories of employment from the protections offered by these statutes. In circumstances where congressional Republicans were adamantly opposed to these laws, the Democratic Party made these racially relevant adjustments to secure a winning coalition that included Southern members of the party. As a result, these new arrangements were friendly to labor but unfriendly to the majority of African Americans who lived below the Mason-Dixon line. Without this fine-tuning, a majority of Southern blacks might have had access to protections negotiated by unions that would have quite shaken the political economy of segregation. Southern Democrats used their blocking powers to ensure this would not happen. As a result, the majority of African Americans were once again left out. So I'll just stop that quote there, because I think this is just a basic argument that it wasn't just unemployment insurance and social programs that agricultural workers and domestic workers were excluded from. It was the ability to organize labor unions. And this was a very intentional choice by Southern Democrats to make this concession to allow expanded union industrial power in the North at the cost of excluding the possibility of black labor organizing in the South, right? So this was obviously hugely detrimental to the power of poor people in the South to aggregate and collectively bargain, defend their rights, and push back against. And again, this is a moment of extreme possibility for the movement. 'Cause obviously, you could say, well, it was just a bridge too far; they would kill the whole bill. But you're talking about moments where there are these marches, there's a Great Depression, there's a war on, and just these moments of strategic concessions that, again, I think Nelson argues are essentially supported oftentimes by Northern labor. I think that's the critical component, is that Northern labor is willing to concede on the exclusion of blacks in the South to ensure it gets its benefits in the North, i.e. white Northern labor, right? So I think that that's a critical component to understanding this as aggregating racial inequity. So just in terms of what you thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those alliances that we see throughout history in terms of, we do need, where folks start to get to a point where, we do need black bodies. We do need black folks politically to some degree. How can we include them in a particular way that does not actually give them teeth or power, right? And the Southern Democrats being very clear about exactly what they wanted and didn't want the black labor class to get. For example, not threatening Jim Crow, being friendly to labor but unfriendly to African Americans below the Mason-Dixon line. There's just this very delicate tightrope of, you can have this so long as you provide a way and a mechanism that certain things are excluded from this particular population, even if we don't name it specifically by name.
Yeah, and again, I wanted to kind of outline this in conversation with our first episode, because it's important for people to understand the difference between a political program and political infrastructure, right? Many of the things we advocate for nowadays are limited time, one-shot deal investments of funding for black people. And some of the stuff from the New Deal kind of became that in the midst of the backlash. So people are very adamant at securing, investments in child care, investments in education, but these are programs. These are oftentimes a one-shot deal or limited time only investments of resources that oftentimes our community does not control. That's distinct from political infrastructure. Like Social Security Act have to be paid every year. Mm-hmm. So accessing Social Security is a guaranteed line item in the federal budget every year. Similarly, the power of unions. Wages have to be paid every 2 weeks. So the ability to negotiate wages and ensure union dues get kicked back to you, an institution you control. So these union, and again, the trillions of dollars flows through employment. While, we get excited over a couple of million for a social program. Right. So the idea of understanding the difference between programming and infrastructure, I think, is a critical part of understanding why unions are so important. Because they are a political infrastructure for the working class that are funded by working class wages, and that working class people have the ability to work their way up and in control. But that just magnifies the downside of racial segregation in the midst of a powered-up union movement. Because, again, the union is expanding its power. It's expanding its social, communal, ethnic networks of leadership building. But it's doing that within a lot of white ethnic communities, right? So you have the Italians, the Germans who are becoming white, and certain, Jewish communities. All these other communities are building networks of union leadership to basically control these unions as political infrastructure for themselves. And there's a hope, obviously, that if black people somehow get in, they could control the infrastructure too. But the reality of anti-blackness and racism in America, I think, has disproven a basic idea that just black folk being in unions means they'll be able to use that political infrastructure for their purposes. There are a lot of things going on within the idea of the union that really complicate this notion. And I think that some of these arguments are well summed up in a book by, he's actually Asian American, wrote it, I believe, in the 70s originally. A guy named Dixiecrat, his book called Settlers. And his argument is essentially, as a trying to do interracial, cross-class, multiracial organizing in the 60s and 70s, him and his friends became frustrated trying to understand why it wasn't working. Because the theories of Mao and Marx would tell you it should work, unified class interests. So he has this book where he's really influenced by black radical scholars, like he spells Africa with a K, which I think looks weird to some people. And, he's basically making this argument that stuff black people have been saying for years, that's like, look, unions are cool, but you can't look at the history of America and not see the limitations of unionism. And I think a lot of folks on the left dismiss this text or don't think about it. But I think just one quote from the text kind of encapsulates, I think, the argument that he's making in general about the limitations of interracial unionism, and goes like this, quote, "When the National Labor Union was formed in 1866, most of its members and leaders clearly intended to simply push aside African labor. The NLU was the first major labor federation of white workers, the forerunner of today's AFL-CIO. Delegates from 59 trade unions and craft organizations took part in the first Baltimore meeting, with observers from most of the rest of the settler craft unions joining into a heady talking and planning. The most advanced settler unionists strongly urged for unity with African workers. This was repeatedly pointed out how the capitalists had used African workers to get around strikes and demands for higher wages by white workers. Rather than let African workers compete in the job market against settlers, they urged to restrain them by taking them into the NLU. As Du Bois pointed out, there was first halting note. Negroes were welcome to the labor movement, not because they were laborers, but because they might be competitors in the market. And a logical conclusion was either to organize them or guard against their actual competition by other methods. It was to this later alternative white American labor must unanimously turn. In other words, settler trade unionists preferred to limit job competition between whites and Africans by driving the latter out of the labor market. All motions to admit Africans to the NLU were defeated as the settler trade unionists continued following the capitalist long-range plan to use them to replace African labor. It should be remembered that in all these deeds, Euro-American labor, no matter how much it huffed and puffed itself up, was just servilely following the genocidal strategies of the industrial bourgeoisie, for which services the capitalists had imported them in the first place. Throughout the empire, but especially in their nations, African workers were organizing their own unions, following their own leaders, launching their own strikes. In Richmond, Virginia, there were strikes by African stevedores and railroad workers and tobacco factory workers. On the heels of the 1867 strikes throughout the South, African unions formed in city after city. Clearly, Euro-American labor was feeling the heat. The colonial competitors were out of control, building their own organizations to further their own interests. This had to be fought. The immediate decision was to warmly invite these African labor unions to join the white NLU so the settler unionists could mislead and undermine them. So at the 1869 LLU conference, for the first time, 9 African union delegates were seated. But the celebration of unity was short-lived. The white trade unionists were, of course, only attempting to deceive African workers. The invitation to join the NLU simply meant that Africans would promise to honor all white strikes and organizing drives. In return, they would have the privilege of being consoled with as white labor savagery and relentlessly annex their jobs. The second aspect of this unity was that the Africans would be expected to follow European labor in opposing democratic demands in the South and helping to restore the chains around their legs. The integration of the NLU meant not only submitting to European hegemony, but was virtually suicidal. Small wonder that Africans quickly departed ways with the NLU.
Can we go back to earlier when you were talking a bit more about, before you got into talking about the book, you highlighted in the passage some of the benefits for the Southerners that they worked out with the northern folks who wanted to to include Black people in the unions. So I got a bit of understanding in hearing that from you and seeing it from the passage of what they were able to work out in that agreement. I did not understand fully what the Northerners got out of it. And then also in this second half where it talks about this African labor force where they can organize by themselves and eventually did and parted ways. What was the benefits for each person involved as we talk about convergence theory? What were the benefits for each side to this connection?
The Northerners, again, these are Northern Democrats who are representing like white ethnics in the North. They want more power for unions. So these are union bills that are passing during the New Deal and World War II. So they have more rights for organizing, again, because these are like white ethnic networks that are in these factories, not exclusively, but so they get more protections for unions, which is like their donor base if you're a Northern Democrat, right? So the cost of that is excluding Black Southerners from the ability to organize within the way the bill's written, right? And so similarly, obviously, like the word scab in like the late 19th century was synonymous with the N-word. Mm-hmm. So Black people have been poor because of slavery. So oftentimes capitalists use poor Black people to undermine like white labor strikes, right? Mm-hmm. So this is part of what Dixiecrat's argument is that white people it wasn't an example of the working class recognizing their innate unity with Black people to invite them in the union. It was not inherently an expression of class solidarity. It was a recognition that these people were a threat to our ability to negotiate wages.
Right.
So we want to eliminate the threat of them to undermine our wages, and that was a prime driver for union integration for Sakai. Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of people in the union movement think that that's offensive because they think of themselves as anti-racist and they may personally be anti-racist. But he's arguing that as a fundamental political move, it was not inherently the recognition of the inherent unity of all working class people that drove interracial unionism. And in fact, if you look at how interracial unionism worked out in reality, it is not logical to think that it was that main driver of fraternity that is what led to interracial unionism, because throughout the book, which obviously we can't cite here, he's talking about how Black people were locked into lower slots in the union because they lack seniority, inherently, because that's how unions work. But that means they did worse work, they did worse paid work, they did dirtier work, they did more dangerous work, and they were excluded from positions of power and leadership within unions. And that reality is a lot to take in if you believe that it was a desire for racial unity that drove interracial unionism.
Right. And
he's given firsthand examples from Alabama. And what he also argues, which I think is true, unions have been a force for working class power in America to push back against capitalists and to push for larger social justice movements. To the extent they have been, it's oftentimes been under the pressure and following Black leadership, both within and outside of unions. So then you start talking about Detroit Revolutionary Action Movement, Detroit Auto Workers, and oftentimes Black auxiliaries that produce Black leadership within unions oftentimes push labor unions versus the left on issues of larger societal justice or issues of greater racial equity than they would have otherwise, right? But that, Sakai argues, is not the dominant reality of interracial unionism, right? And so if this argument is true, and Katznelson argues that it's true, it serves as a tool to aggregate more power and ability within the white community, right? So obviously, folks have took issue with this argument, especially the way that some people articulate it as, race is the only thing that matters, racism is first and everything else is second, the reality of anti-Blackness is bigger than everything else. In terms of like Twitter popular culture. So Torrey Reed, who is the son of a prominent class-conscious, class-centric academic, Adolph Reed, a junior, I believe, he wrote a book Towards Freedom, The Case Against Race Reductionism. And his argument is that people like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who cite Katznelson, are talking about the fact that laborers were excluded from the unions and excluded from benefit packages from the New Deal, ignoring the fact that white people were excluded too. So if it was just about race, why would they exclude white people? It had to be more about class. And I think that it's interesting to me that Katznelson does not ignore that reality, but he just says, they're so racist they were willing to even screw over white people.
Right.
Because they loved Jim Crow so much. And they were so afraid of black people benefiting from this, right? So just recognizing the reality that white people got screwed over too is not inherently proof that it wasn't race involved in this reality, right? And, you know, I checked. From what I can see, Touré Reed does not cite Jay Sakai one time. Not to answer him, not to criticize him, not to nothing with him. And I think those are the academic realities that I think this podcast will try to point out. That if you have an argument against someone like Jay Sakai, I mean, he's inflammatory. He's clearly writing in a particular style that's not academic per se, that is more polemical, but you got to respond to the argument.
Right.
I believe you have to respond to the argument. And he doesn't. In fact, I was listening to a white leftist podcast that calls itself like Marxist adjacent, but it's more comedy focused. And they're like making fun of Jay Sakai's book, Settlers, and the people who use that book. Because some people use it to make the argument that all white people are inherently racist and they should go burn in hell or whatever, which is not his argument. But then they both admit they had never read the book.
Oh.
And they're just going by the people on Twitter who cite the book as their perception of what the book says. Oh, boy. And I think this is just a dominant dynamic where oftentimes people aren't really engaging with the literature or the arguments embedded in the literature. They're engaging with the most inflammatory, extreme versions of people contorting the literature. Right. Which I think is kind of what Touré is doing with, because he doesn't actually respond to Ira Katznelson. He responds to Ta-Nehisi Coates, citing Ira Katznelson. I see. And he's really responding to the people on Twitter who use Ta-Nehisi Coates to say, "Oh, woe is me, I'm black. I'm so under oppression. Everyone should just pay attention to me and love me." Right. And that can be annoying, while also some of the things Ira Katznelson says can be true. Right. So yeah, I think this is just a really interesting place of conversation around some nuance around these arguments around race versus class and unions, good, bad, and the reality of race in America and class in America. Right. But of course, the union power movement does not last. So Katznelson begins to talk about the racialized dynamics at the core of the backlash to unions. So he goes on to further explain when the union movement's under pressure and no longer having the power, it makes strategic concessions to further his argument that it wasn't so much this commitment to interracial social justice was at their core. They ended up turning inward from larger social justice fights and focusing more on benefits for their constituents who are largely white. So this is the way that he explains the turn against unions and what unions did in response to that. Why did Southern members of Congress abandon their support for New Deal labor policies that had been adjusted to suit their preferences, their segregationist preferences, that is? Right. At the core of their near universal shift to the position geared to make union organizing more difficult and restrict federal intervention in labor markets was a radical transformation in the way in which they understood labor issues. When domestic and agricultural exclusions had made integral to labor legislation in the 1930s, they had viewed these voices primarily as choices about party loyalty and ideological conviction. As labor unions began to enjoy increased, unexpected success in the South, and as non-Southern New Deal liberals pressed to create more expansive federal administration to advance labor interests without relating where race intersects with labor, Southerners in the House and the Senate chose closed ranks to consider labor questions defensively. From their standpoint, labor matters no longer were a minor sideshow where they could compromise with other members of the Democratic Party in exchange for regional favors. They now had good reasons to fear that labor organizing might fuel civil rights activism. They were concerned that close enforcement of the Fair Labor Standards Act would cause wage leveraging across racial lines. Zealous bureaucrats might use their administrative discretion, reinforced by wartime anti-discrimination efforts, to confront racially discriminatory practices by state government officials. Having merged insolubly with race, labor votes now evoked preferences in Southern minds geared more to guard racism. This distinguished Democrats from Republicans. The tight labor market induced by wartime industrial expansion was fueled by large federal investments, by urbanization, by substantial developments of military bases. This in turn facilitated aggressive union efforts to take advantage of the legal climate that had been created by the Wagner Act, but previously had little effect on the South. In just 2 years, from Pearl Harbor to late 1943, industrial employment in the South grew from 1.6 million to 2.3 million workers. And many farm and sharecroppers who experienced military service or worked at war centers were not prepared to tolerate a return to pre-war conditions. These advancements were pregnant with deep-seated implications for Southern race relations. Because, quote, the Negro constitutes a relatively large and permanent part of Southern industrial labor force in such areas as tobacco, lumber, iron, and steel, successful unionization of such industries requires the organization of colored workers. And this person added that based on wartime experience, including experience of multiracial union locals, there was evidence to the effect that workers among both races were beginning to realize the economic cooperation was not only possible but desirable. Both the AFL and CIO, with the dramatic title Operation Dixie, announced major recruiting campaigns in the summer of 1946 based upon the understanding, as the CIO perspective had declared, that a relatively unorganized South is a menace to our organized movement in the North, and likewise to Northern industries. The campaigns began optimistically. By the end of 47, the CIO announced, almost a certainly exaggeration, it recruited 400,000 new Southern members. However, these campaigns meeting intense resistance by local elites and police forces, ambivalent about how much to confront Jim Crow, and increasingly caught up in competitive and internecine battles soon began to falter. It was the shifts in the legal climate that most decisively helped bring efforts to such an end. By late 48, the aftermath of the Taft-Hartley, the AFL formally and the CIO both informally closed their Southern campaigns. So that's just the story of a backlash to Southern unionism. So that's granting that there is a potential cross-racial unity that is beneficial to both races, but in the face of backlash from some members on the ground, but also just powerful elites, the interracial union efforts, as have been proven throughout history, began to falter. And I think what people need to understand is that the war was forced interest convergence. When does this stuff fall apart? After the war ends.
Right.
The war ends in 45. So after there's no longer the absolute impetus of interracial organization during the war, the interracial unionism movement no longer has as much momentum because people are like, okay, no more war, I get to be racist again. Right. And so, but here's the part I wanted to focus on to just conclude the quote. It's actually a separate segment of the book, but it relates to the story.
Okay.
In the South and elsewhere, has been the increased use of right to speech by employers to intervene, frankly, in elections where collective bargaining elections were lost. Significantly, it said the company won. This anti-union campaign is inevitably coercive upon employees, as this goes much further than it was permitted, even though the last days of the Wagner Acts, by such means, labor consistently was thrown on the defensive. And this is what they do. The cooperation offered by many states in enforcing minimum wages and maximum hours waned, especially in the South. When the impact of more limited possibilities became clear to leaders in organized labor, they opted to make three faithful moves, and this is what I wanted to get to. All rational in this new context and all successful in the short term. First, they reined in their once ambitious, focused on the South, to make the labor movement a genuinely national force. This strategically now become prohibitively costly. Instead, they opted to focus attention where their strength already was considerable, i.e. the North. Second, they concentrated on making collective bargaining a settled, orderly, and productive process, trading off management prerogatives for generous, secure wage settlements indexed to inflation. Third, rather than the continued fight for a more advanced national welfare state for all Americans, they concentrated on securing private pensions and health insurance provisions for their members that would be financed mainly by employers. So I really want to take those three things into account, because when people talk about the inherent progressive potential of unions, they're basically saying that it's in their interest to fight for larger social justice issues. They have a comprehensive beef with the capitalists who are stealing all the value of their labor. And they want this labor value redistributed in general for all working people, so they are going to push for more radical social policies, social welfare policies in general, because they have a beef with the capitalists in general. And this is explicitly saying that after the war, explicitly in the face of the failure of interracial organizing and the general backlash by the capitalist class to the New Deal, they basically pull back in their larger, more transformative visions for social justice and focus more on wages and benefits for people who are already in unions. So rather than even growing the union, they hunker down and focus on benefits for people who are in unions rather than growing the union or bettering social conditions in general for people exploited by capitalism, even if they're not in the union.
And at what point in history did that shift happen?
This is 1940s, 1950s. So this is Red Scare.
Yeah.
This is McCarthyism. This is the failure of interracial unionism, drives in the South as previously isolated, and just a general settling of the American middle class post-war. This is part of what Dixiecrat and others argue, is that you give somebody a house, they own the house, they're less likely to be a socialist because they don't want nobody redistributing their house.
Right.
Right? You give them a vested stake in America, they may become less interested in wide-scale redistribution of wealth because they got some wealth now.
Right.
Right? Now, that's one way to think about it. I think this text is more explicitly focused on, like, they chose to focus on collective bargaining, which is explicitly about locking in their wage gains as opposed, as basically their tool of political power. Because collective bargaining, it's a very insular process. You got to have your union lawyers and deal with the employer, or if your employers to state, you got to deal with public sector unions. They've made it a very professional process, but that trades off with more larger, broader demands about wages in general. You know what I mean? It's like locking in a contract explicitly for your union members as opposed to broader fights about wages in general.
When you were looking into this and reading the other texts as well, did it show anything around a shift in the number of African Americans that entered unions, left unions, began to unionize on their own? Was there a shift each time there was this shift in interest, shift in political strategy? Was there an increase or decrease in the number of African Americans that were in unions?
Well, the book doesn't provide detailed numbers on African American unionism, but I think the argument is that there were fundamental conditions that were more favorable to interracial unionism in general, especially in the South. And the choice is also made to essentially focus more on the North, the industrial North, which, as people will point out, would leave the South as a reservoir of cheap labor. And that's basically what's hurting the unions right now, is that many companies don't move their factories overseas, they move them to the South because the labor is cheaper down there and there's less powerful organized labor. So people were arguing even back then, don't do this, because you're basically creating a reality where capitalists can always undermine our power by just moving to the South.
Yeah.
So if you don't focus on intentionally unionizing the South, then you're going to cut off our ability to prevent our capitalists from moving the labor to the South and screwing our northern unions. And I think I would argue, not in either, and Sakai would argue probably as well, is that part of the problem is that to do that, you would have to give more power to black people in the South. And that would have had to be an intentional organizing strategy that would have been central to interracial unionism to get Southerners to actually buy into it. Now, it would have fallen foul of Jim Crow and raised lots of very devastating accusations of red baiting, and people got their lives destroyed by being called communist. And communist is in some ways just like another word for integrationist in some ways in America at that time. So it wouldn't have been easy. Not saying it would have been just right there, but it led to the reality we see today where, where do they build a lot of cars? They build them in the South. Toyota, Volkswagen, they have all these factories in like Tennessee. And it's hard to win union drives in these factories because people to this day don't, have seen unions not always as a liberatory force, but it's like, it's good for some people, but those people don't tend to be my people. They get lots of propaganda negatively as well. But this is a choice. This is a choice that has ramifications throughout time. And I think just really pointing out that choice as a strategy shows the difficulty of anything else, the difficulty of just saying unions themselves in general are this emancipatory force, because of the reality that other texts have pointed out, so much of unions serves to social networks, white ethnic networks that had a hard time dealing with bringing in new people who wanted to have their own ethnic networks, have their own ancillaries. Not everybody wanted to be in an integrated union. They wanted to have black auxiliaries to the union that they controlled themselves. In Baltimore, there was a study of basically they integrated the unions in the 70s, and that led to the black auxiliary losing hours to the white folks. And they got so bad because when you have a black-led union auxiliary, the black people can impose discipline on each other. They can make you make sure you don't steal, make sure you show up for your hours. And they were more productive, they argued. Not anybody else, they argued, within their own independent organizing structure, i.e. the segregated structure. So much so that when the federal government desegregated them, they actually asked to be resegregated in Baltimore in the 70s, right? So this is the unfortunate complex reality of interracial unionism, where it's just not nearly as simple or easy, I think, as folks sometimes make it out to be. But the point of the conversation is thinking about why people care about affirmative action is because we need to benefit. And how do we benefit? What can we do? What models have worked? So there's a really long quote. I'm not going to read it. But the book talks about at the end, and in this quote, one of the most successful things wasn't through the unions. It was the integration of the military. And the integration of the military was itself obviously a form of, in some ways, affirmative action, but just generally building an infrastructure, a pipeline of black people to get some pay, some benefits, even if they were curtailed, but an incredibly powerful tool to build up a potential black middle class that would serve as the foot soldiers of not just civil rights, but black power. So I'm not going to read the quote, but just some things that are in the quote is that in 1939, the average black wage in the United States was $371. Compared to the country as a whole, the average wage was $964. In the military, cash wages and in-kind provisions were worth between $2,000 and $2,600 per year. So just getting into the military gave them a raise of up to 7, 8, 9 times what they were making before. It's not a critique of the unions to say there's no collective bargaining agreement. There is no union contract that multiplied your wages 10 times. Right. But on top of that, they got these skills. They got skills like psychology, postal service, water purification. With the situation in Jackson now, we could use some more of that. Chaplains, carpentry, painting, map making, drafting, fuels, ignition, auditing, physical therapy, optical repair, tire repair, all stuff they were excluded from under these regimes of segregation. And this is all literally because they need to fight this war. And because, as the text argues, the white people got into the military. That left a bunch of black men around white women. So they were like, you can't leave all these black men not being drafted while the white men are drafted, getting these great benefits. But there's too many black men around the white women. We got to get them in the military.
You got to cut that out.
Interest convergence, but still, it's like, and the other thing is illiteracy. The third big benefit, because people talk about the GI Bill and black people going to college, that's important, but the big benefit of military integration was you had to be literate to be in the military. That was, in fact, how they excluded black people from the military when they didn't want them in the military. I'd love to see a study if black people were faking being stupid to avoid military service. I imagine that's probably part of the dynamic as well for some people.
That would be interesting.
But there was a massive effort to basically, you're going to be a threat to people's lives if you can't read a map or you can't read directions. So you have to be literate in the military. So that was a massive literacy effort targeted at taking illiterate black soldiers and making them literate. And they had better results than the white soldiers in these literacy campaigns. So there was a massive, hundreds of thousands of black men got access to literacy for the first time in the military, right? So that's an example of, historically, a policy that materially changed conditions for black people, not just in the money they made, but in terms of the skills and access to literacy they got, was military integration. So if we decenter elite graduate schools as the center of affirmative action, and use military integration as more of an example of affirmative action in the future, what types of things can we think about that successful example of something that benefited black folks can teach us about what to do in the future? Because unfortunately, given the Supreme Court as it is, affirmative action as we know it may not be long for this world.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I think one of the biggest themes throughout the entire things is make it beneficial for white people.
Well, you need to have leverage. You need to use the power of interest convergence to your advantage. Exactly.
That's what leverage is. That's what it's like. In every last one of those situations, there was not this effort to do any of this because out of the kindness of anyone's heart or because of my fellow man. It was because this is going to benefit me this way, or this is going to give me a leg up in this particular way. So. I mean, that's the reoccurring theme throughout all of this. Yeah,
and to sort of wrap up here, part of what we argue at LBS in our political work is being able to figure out, like you said, interest convergence in spaces where black folks have a competitive advantage over white people. So those are two things. Interest convergence, competitive advantage, and building political infrastructure as opposed to more political programs.
Yes.
So those would be the three things I would use as a metric for whatever you want to call it, affirmative action, black folks benefiting. How do we make those moves happen? And I think that one of the things that we do at LBS is focus on the human social service system. You know, addiction care, child care, education, social work. Because for one thing, white women especially, have taken over these jobs. But they don't like really working with these black folks. Yeah. White people love working with, you know, black folks like me, like gifted and talented kids. Mm-hmm. They don't like working with like people who've been in jail, people who are addicted. They'd rather not. Mm-hmm. They would rather honestly just let us do it, because what they want is the black lower classes to no longer be so destitute, because they're burdening their healthcare facilities, their emergency care facilities,
their social
services. They're decreasing property values, and that's a huge thing. It's like homeless people who are shooting each other, they're a threat to white people's property values. And that's why white people care.
Right.
So we're making an argument that, look, we as working class black people have certain skills and technologies of thinking about how to do services for these folks that you don't have. Mm-hmm. All you want is for them to not be a problem for you anymore. Mm-hmm. Give us the money. We'll deal with it. Mm-hmm. You can do whatever you want.
Right.
But also, if you don't do it, we're going to call you racist. We're going to vote you. We're going to Democratic politicians that give you money. We're going to vote them out. We're going to call them racist. We're not just going to call them racist. We're going to demonstrate how the methodologies you use, the scholarship you use, the ideological theories you use, they are racist, and they don't work. Mm-hmm. So anybody who cares about racism can understand the value of the move. But even if you don't care about racism, you just care about it working because you want the property values to go up. It's like they can do it. Y'all can't. The white liberals. Like, I just want black people to stop coming into my ER because they can't pay for services. I'm an insurance company. I don't care about racism. I'm not woke, but the black people say they can stop people from coming into the ER and using up services they can't pay for. Mm-hmm. So the unfortunate reality is we can't always depend on the morality of white folks to get access to employment opportunity. We need to have some sort of competitive advantage, and we need to politically organized to get access to resources to build a workforce, a trained workforce that operationalizes our unique skills to serve our community. So when we talk about the work we're doing around reparations for the war on drugs, things like addiction services that are actually using, we talked about it on this channel, the skills and the legacy of black people to serve a problem that maybe the white infrastructure doesn't have a good of a solution to. Mm-hmm. It's crazy how much black addiction service histories are just ignored in the white addiction academic literature. Mm. And there's just so much possibility beyond 12-step and Eurocentric harm reduction to fund black people to address addiction, because it's not just substance dependence physically. You might want to die because you hate yourself so much, because of racism or because of trauma or because of so many different things. Your family turning against you because you had to steal to feed your habit. That means something unique for black people that white people may not fully have the understanding of. And finding political infrastructure, not just funding from a program to do it. So stop just focusing on foundations to give you money, but really focus on, like, what is the political infrastructure you can hijack or plug into to consistently fund your movements or fund your work, right? So, for example, we didn't talk about this when we talked about addiction, but like these settlements that they're making with the opioid companies, these are multi-billion-dollar settlements. That money's going to flow for 20 years. That's the type of thing where it's like, given the disparate impacts of addiction, like we should control that. Mm-hmm. Like, we should just make this is new money that no one has a claim to. We should just take something like that, build political infrastructure to make that a way to fund human social service ecosystems that we control. So nowhere in there is there a quota. Nowhere in there is there a specific race-based criteria. Mm-hmm. We're just making an objective argument that we have a better way to provide the service, and we have intellectual analysis and histories and facts to prove it. And the goal is to build a political infrastructure to use that as a way to do what affirmative action was supposed to do for us.
I wonder, tell me what you think about the approach of, for example, the Southern Democrats during 1930s, 40s, and 50s with the New Deal, in that they would not explicitly say, we're going to leave out African American veterans, or we're not specifically leaving out African American people, but they would do it occupationally. Is there a strategy somewhere in there wherein a person can identify vocations, locations, or something along those lines, if, for example, if there's a partnership to be made, if there's a resource exchange that need to, or a something along those lines, wherein that is also a strategy to be adopted to say to focus on this and not focus on race in that particular way.
Yeah. I guess I kind of hear what you're saying. So, like for example, one thing that if there are spaces where Black folks have a competitive advantage, where they have found ways to build more of a space or have a unique claim to that space, I think it's useful to sort of stipulate that should be funded more. You don't have to say only fund Black people to do it.
Yeah.
But you can word the analysis in a way that's going to be shaded towards Black people getting the money for it. It's like last time with addiction, that's what I've been studying a lot of. We talked about psychedelic integration therapy. So it's not about helping people use psychedelics, because you can't promote that because it's not legal. But if you happen to have used psychedelics, the things you have seen while high could be difficult for you to interpret, or it may be causing you trauma through these things you experience while high. So while not promoting psychedelic use, these services help people relate to what they experience, which often can be very powerful, very traumatic with a bad trip. And Black people, from what I've seen, may have some unique skills in doing that in terms of like African histories of dream interpretation or understanding of like ancestral imagery through things like that. So if you're doing things like psychedelic integration therapy from a culturally sensitive perspective as one of the things you prioritize as what you get funded in whatever bill or infrastructure you produce, that's not going to say only Black people can do that. And the goal isn't for only Black people to do it, because Native Americans need their own version of that.
Yeah.
White people need their own version of that. But that's going to embed a certain framework that's going to prefer Black people getting opportunity. But the goal is also, and this is one thing we have to really talk about, when you do that, you have to have already been cultivating people in that network to politically demand that and build up their capacity to take that money and do those services. Because a lot of times we do the opposite. We find the money, wherever the money is, we say we can do that. And we destroy everything we're doing and do what the money tells us to do. Because we need to develop a certain expertise, then find whatever money is possible and force that into the infrastructure we already built.
Got it.
Right. I think that's just a different political way of thinking that, unfortunately, because we don't have political infrastructure, we've been forced to demand any job that we can get. We act like we can do it when we can't do everything. But what we do well, we should build political infrastructure to make sure that more and more people can get funded to do that work, and we can train more people to do that work, and those people then become a political organizing force to protect that money and build political infrastructure off of those investments, right? So yeah, I mean, in the face of affirmative action potentially being, traditional affirmative action being struck down, we have to think about new, innovative ways to defend our ability to employ each other and build upon the history and legacy of work around that. So if you support the work we're doing politically with LBS, please visit lbsbaltimore.com, lbsbaltimore.com/sustain to invest in our work. Be sure to visit Black Power Media, check out the other shows on Black Power Media, and continue to come back here every Wednesday, hopefully, as we continue to go in search of Black Power. Thank you, and see you again soon.